Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the Grand Council chamber on Nexus Prime, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Around her, delegates from 47 different species watched with expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to barely concealed anger. The massive holographic display behind her showed the official seal of the Terran Federation, its blue and gold colors soon to disappear from galactic politics forever. The Terran Federation hereby formally withdraws from all galactic institutions. Effective immediately, Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. This includes the Galactic Council, the Trade Consortium, the Defense Alliance, and all associated organizations. General Kex Thara, the towering Althari military commander, let out a sound that his species used to express contempt. His arms crossed over his armored chest as he leaned back in his seat. "Finally," he rumbled, his deep voice echoing off the chamber walls, "the galaxy will be more orderly without human chaos." Vrex Trade Minister Zilch clicked his mandibles in what passed for laughter among his insectoid people. "The profit opportunities will be substantial," he said, his multifaceted eyes already calculating. "Human inefficiency has cost us billions," but not everyone shared their confidence. Vankira, the elderly Cathari scholar, shifted uncomfortably in her floating chair. Her large, dark eyes watched Elena with something that might have been regret. She had worked with humans for decades, translating ancient texts and sharing knowledge. Unlike many of her colleagues, she understood what the galaxy was about to lose. Elena had expected these reactions. For 300 years, humans had served as the galaxy's problem-solvers, mediators, and fix-it crew. They ran the shipping lanes that connected distant worlds. They maintained the massive jump gates that made interstellar travel possible. When species couldn't agree on trade routes or territorial disputes, human diplomats found compromises that somehow satisfied everyone. But after the Andromeda incident 3 months ago, everything had changed. A human exploration ship had made first contact with a previously unknown species, following all established protocols. The contact had gone wrong when the aliens misunderstood a greeting gesture as a threat. The resulting conflict had cost lives on both sides before cooler heads prevailed. The Galactic Council had blamed humanity for the disaster. They said humans were too reckless, too unpredictable, too willing to take risks. Never mind that the protocols they had followed were written by the Council itself. Never mind that human quick thinking had ultimately prevented a larger war. The Council needed a scapegoat, and humans were convenient. So humanity had made a choice. If the galaxy didn't want their help, they wouldn't give it. "The withdrawal process will take 60 standard days," Elena continued, ignoring the murmurs spreading through the chamber. "All human personnel will be recalled to Sol system. All human-operated facilities will be shut down in an orderly fashion." "What about our contracts?" demanded a Vrex trade representative, his voice sharp with panic. "Human shipping companies handle 70% of our cargo routes." Elena's expression didn't change. "Those contracts will be terminated according to their emergency clauses. We're sure your superior mathematical models will find more efficient solutions." The insult was subtle but clear. The Vrex had spent decades complaining that human shipping was inefficient, that their routes made no mathematical sense, that a proper algorithmic approach would be better. Now they would get their chance to prove it. Across the galaxy, the withdrawal had already begun. Dr. Marcus Chen, head of the Human Engineering Corps, stood in the control room of Jump Gate Station Alpha 7, watching his teams pack up 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge and equipment. The massive gate outside the station's windows had guided ships safely between star systems for over 200 years. Its human-designed control systems had never failed, not once. "Sir," called Lieutenant Sarah Kim from her console, "the Althari engineering team is here to take over operations." Marcus nodded grimly. The Althari were competent engineers, he had to admit. Their technology was solid, their procedures thorough, but they thought in straight lines, following rigid protocols without the flexibility that had made human systems so reliable. They would learn the hard way that space was not a place for rigid thinking. On the agricultural world of New Eden, human terraforming specialists were shutting down atmospheric processors that had been running perfectly for 40 years. The alien. Colonists who lived there watched nervously as the massive machines powered down. These processors had turned a dead world into a garden, creating breathable air and fertile soil where none had existed before. "Don't worry," the local Cathari administrator had told the colonists. "Our technicians can handle simple maintenance." But the human systems weren't simple, though they appeared so on the surface. They had been designed to work with the planet's unique chemistry, its weather patterns, its seasonal variations. The Cathari saw only the basic functions, not the subtle adjustments that kept everything in balance. In the asteroid mining facilities of the Outer Rim, human engineers were departing from operations that had run smoothly for decades. The facilities extracted rare minerals essential to galactic civilization. Without human oversight, the delicate balance between extraction rates and structural integrity would be left to alien crews who saw only the immediate task, not the long-term consequences. Thus, Galactic Emergency Response Fleet was perhaps the hardest hit. 60% of its personnel were human. From the pilots who flew rescue missions to the coordinators who managed complex multi-species operations. Admiral Jiang Wei, the fleet's human commander, stood on the bridge of his flagship as ship, after ship departed for Sol System. "Admiral," said his Althari second-in-command, "surely some of your people could stay. The fleet needs experienced officers." Zhang shook his head. "The Council made their position clear. They don't want human recklessness endangering galactic security." His voice was bitter. The emergency fleet had saved millions of lives over the years, often by breaking regulations and taking risks that more cautious species wouldn't consider. Back on Nexus Prime, Elena was finishing her final address to the Council. The delegates sat in uncomfortable silence now, beginning to realize the scope of what was happening. It wasn't just a political withdrawal. It was the departure of the species that had become the galaxy's connective tissue, the problem solvers who made everything work. "You seem confident that you can manage without us," Elena said, looking around the chamber. "We hope you're right. But remember this moment when your perfect systems start to fail. Remember that you chose pride over partnership." She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Behind her, the holographic seal of the Terran Federation faded away. Venkira watched Elena go with growing unease. She had spent her life studying patterns, connections, the way complex systems interacted, and she could see what her colleagues couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Humans weren't just another species in the galactic community. They were the species that made the community work. As Elena's ship departed Nexus Prime carrying the last official human representative away from galactic politics, the station's lights flickered briefly. It was a small malfunction in the human-designed power grid, quickly corrected by automated systems. But Venkira noticed it and filed it away. In her memory, the galaxy was about to learn what it meant to lose its immune system. The lessons would be hard, and they would come faster than anyone expected. In the vast darkness of space, the ships of humanity turned their backs on the stars they had helped connect, heading home to a system that had been their first step into the galaxy. Behind them, they left a civilization that thought it could function without them. It was about to discover just how wrong it was. 6 months after humanity's departure, Vrex Trade Minister Zilch stood before a wall of flashing red indicators in his new command center. Each red light represented a shipping route in crisis, a delivery delayed, or a trade agreement falling apart. What had once been the galaxy's most efficient cargo network now looked like a disaster map. "Explain this to me again," Zilch said, his mandibles clicking with frustration. His assistant, a younger Vrex named Click, nervously adjusted the holographic display. The mathematical models are perfect, Minister, Click insisted. Our algorithms calculate the most efficient routes between all major worlds. Travel time is reduced by an average of 12% compared to human routes. Then why, Zilch's voice rose to a screech, are we losing money on every single shipment? The answer was simple, though neither Vrex wanted to admit it. Human. Shipping routes had never been about pure mathematical efficiency. They had been about understanding that the Spirian Collective considered certain star systems sacred during their mourning seasons. They had known that Tornax merchants refused to use routes that passed through space claimed by their ancestral enemies. They had remembered that the crystalline beings of Sector 7 could only receive cargo during their planet's winter months, when the heat wouldn't damage their fragile forms. The human routes had seemed inefficient because they accounted for dozens of cultural quirks, religious taboos, and biological needs that couldn't be calculated in an algorithm. Now Vrex ships, carrying medical supplies, found themselves blocked by Spirian funeral fleets. Tornax clans had declared trade wars over insulting route assignments. 3 separate diplomatic incidents had erupted in just the past month. Meanwhile, on the industrial world of Kepler 442b, Chief Engineer Thak Morin stood in the control room of Atmospheric Processor Unit 7, watching his instruments with growing alarm. The massive machine, one of 12 that had been converting the planet's toxic atmosphere for 20 years, was operating at only 60% efficiency. The human protocols were unnecessarily complex, Thak Morin had told his team when they took over the facility. Our simpler approach will be more reliable. The Althari had removed what they considered redundant safety systems. They had streamlined the chemical processes, eliminated what they saw as wasteful backup procedures, and implemented their standard military-grade maintenance schedule. Everything should have been running perfectly. Instead, the atmospheric processors were failing one by one. The simplified chemical processes couldn't handle the planet's seasonal atmospheric changes. The streamlined systems had no flexibility to adapt when solar radiation levels shifted. The rigid maintenance schedule ignored the fact that some components wore out faster in the planet's unique environment. Outside the facility's reinforced windows, Thak Morin could see the first toxic storm in over a decade building on the horizon. The purple clouds that had once covered this world were returning, and with them came the deadly gases that could kill most oxygen-breathing species in minutes. 3 million colonists from 12 different species lived on Kepler 442b. They had built cities, raised families, and created thriving communities in what had once been a hellish wasteland. Now they watched the skies with growing fear as the life-giving air their children breathed slowly turned poisonous again. On the research station orbiting Altair Prime, Venkira studied the reports flooding in from across the galaxy with increasing alarm. As one of the few scholars who had worked closely with humans for decades, she was beginning to see patterns that others missed. The humans hadn't just run the galaxy's systems. They had been the systems. Their minds worked differently from other species, seeing connections where others saw separate problems, finding solutions that bridged the gaps between different ways of thinking. Computer, display galactic infrastructure status, Venkira commanded. The holographic map that appeared before her was a web of red warning lights. Power grids failing, communication networks down, transportation routes blocked. It was as if the galaxy's nervous system was shutting down. Her research assistant, a young Cathari named Mel Vok, floated beside her with obvious worry. Scholar, the pattern is clear. Every system experiencing failures had significant human involvement. Venkira nodded grimly. It's worse than that. Show me the cascade analysis. The display changed, showing how failures in one system triggered problems in others. A communication breakdown led to shipping delays. Shipping delays caused resource shortages. Resource shortages stressed power grids. Power grid failures shut down manufacturing plants. It was a domino effect spreading across the galaxy. In the frontier systems, the situation was becoming desperate. The Outer Rim had always been a dangerous place, home to pirates, smugglers, and worse. But human patrol fleets had kept the lawlessness contained, their flexible tactics and quick thinking perfect for dealing with unpredictable threats. Captain Rex Tor commanded an Althari battlecruiser now patrolling the trade routes near the Vega system. His ship was powerful, his crew well-trained, and his weapons systems were among the best in the galaxy. He should have been more than capable of handling a few ragtag pirates. Instead, he found himself completely outmaneuvered by enemies who refused to fight fair. The pirates used hit-and-run tactics, struck from unexpected directions, and disappeared before his heavy weapons could target them. His rigid military training had prepared him for battles between fleets, not cat and mouse. Games with criminals who broke every rule of honorable combat. "Sir," reported his communications officer, "we've lost contact with Cargo Fleet 7. Their last transmission indicated they were under attack." Rex Tor studied the tactical display with frustration. The pirates were hitting multiple targets, simultaneously forcing his patrol ships to spread thin across impossible distances. The human patrol commanders had somehow managed to be everywhere at once, but Rex Tor's linear thinking couldn't grasp how they had done it. What he didn't understand was that human patrol strategies had relied on intuition as much as planning. Human commanders had learned to think like pirates, to anticipate their moves, to be unpredictable themselves. They had built networks of informants, used psychological warfare, and most importantly, they had been willing to take risks that more cautious species avoided. The Althari fought with honor and discipline. The pirates fought to win. Back on Nexus Prime, the Galactic Council's emergency meeting was not going well. The great chamber that had once hosted dignified debates between civilized species now echoed with accusations and recriminations. "The Vrex shipping monopoly is destroying our economy," shouted Ambassador Velcris of the Spiral Alliance. "Our colonies haven't received medical supplies in 3 months. Our mathematical models are flawless," Zilch protested, his voice rising to match hers. "If your people would simply follow logical trade practices instead of your primitive superstitions." Primitive? Velcris was on her feet now, her crystalline skin glowing with anger. "Your logical ships have violated 7 sacred sites. The ancestors curse your entire species." General Kexthera slammed his 4 fists on the table, demanding order. But even his imposing presence couldn't calm the chaos. Every species was blaming every other species for problems that seemed to be spreading faster than anyone could solve them. Only Venkira remained calm, quietly taking notes on her personal datapad. She had begun documenting what she privately called the human factor, the countless ways that humanity had been the galaxy's connective tissue, binding different species together through understanding and compromise. "Perhaps," she said during a brief lull in the shouting, "we should consider that these problems began when humanity departed." The chamber fell silent for a moment. Then General Kexthera's laugh boomed across the room. "Ridiculous," he declared. "These are temporary adjustment difficulties. We simply need time to optimize our new procedures." But privately, even Kexthera was beginning to worry. His military advisors reported that piracy had increased by 300% in just 6 months. Entire sectors were becoming no-go zones for civilian shipping. And worst of all, his own forces seemed unable to adapt to the new threat environment. As the council meeting devolved into chaos once again, Venkira quietly left the chamber. She had work to do, data to analyze, patterns to document. Because, unlike her colleagues, she understood that what they were witnessing wasn't a series of unrelated problems. It was the slow-motion collapse of galactic civilization. The humans had been more than just another species in the community. They had been the species that made the community possible. Their departure hadn't left a gap in the galaxy's structure. It had removed the foundation everything else was built on. And now, As systems failed and conflicts erupted, the galaxy was. Learning what happened when you lost not just your problem solvers, but the only species capable of seeing problems as connected parts of a larger whole. The worst part was, it was only the beginning. 18 months after humanity's withdrawal, the emergency session of the Galactic Council met aboard the hastily converted cargo vessel, Resilient Dawn. Nexus Prime, the galaxy's political center for over 5 centuries, had been abandoned 3 weeks ago when its life support systems finally collapsed beyond repair. Ambassador Thel Koros of the Unified Worlds stood before the assembled delegates, his usually perfect diplomatic composure cracked with exhaustion and desperation. Behind him, a holographic display showed the galaxy in a way none of them had ever seen before. Vast sections colored red for systems offline, entire sectors marked as communication lost. The situation has moved beyond crisis, Thel Koros began, his voice hollow. We are facing the complete breakdown of galactic civilization. The numbers were staggering. The hyperspace beacon network, maintained for centuries by human technicians, was failing faster than alien engineers could repair it. Jump calculations that had once taken minutes now required hours of computation, assuming the destination beacon was still functioning. Ships that had once crossed the galaxy in days now took weeks to travel between neighboring systems. Trade had collapsed entirely in some sectors. The Vrex Consortium, once the galaxy's dominant economic force, had declared bankruptcy after their rigid mathematical models proved utterly incapable of handling the organic complexity of interstellar commerce. Their automated systems had created bottlenecks at every major hub, triggering shortages of everything from basic foodstuffs to medical. Supplies, Zilch, the former trade minister, sat slumped in his chair, his once proud mandibles dull with defeat. His species' superior calculating abilities had meant nothing when faced with the impossible task of managing relationships between dozens of species with different needs, customs, and taboos. The humans had made it look easy because they understood that trade was about trust and relationships, not just numbers and efficiency. The Devourer has consumed 3 more systems, reported General Kex Thera, his voice grim. The massive military commander had aged visibly in the past months, his armor scarred from desperate battles against an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. The entity they called the Devourer had appeared in the Outer Rim 6 months ago, a parasitic organism that consumed entire ecosystems, growing stronger with each planet it destroyed. Traditional military responses had proven not just useless, but counterproductive. The creature adapted to every attack, evolved with each encounter, turned their own weapons against them. My fleets engage it with everything we have, Kex Thera continued, his 4 arms hanging limp with exhaustion. But it learns from every battle, our tactics, our weapons, our formations. It adapts faster than we can change our strategies. What he didn't say, couldn't say, was that the Althari military doctrine was built around overwhelming force and rigid discipline. It worked perfectly against conventional enemies who fought by predictable rules. But the Devourer didn't follow any rules. It was creative in its destruction, innovative in its adaptation, flexible in ways that the military mind couldn't comprehend. The humans would have understood it instantly. They would have found ways to be unpredictable, to change tactics in the middle of battle, to think outside the constraints of military tradition. But the humans were gone, and their former allies were dying by the millions as they tried to fight chaos with order. Vankira floated near the back of the converted cargo hold, listening to the reports with growing despair. Her research station had become an unofficial refugee center for beings from across the galaxy, scientists, engineers, teachers, all fleeing the collapse of their respective systems. Scholar Vankira, Thel Koros called out, your research into pre-withdrawal infrastructure has been illuminating. What is your assessment of our current situation? All eyes turned to the elderly Ketheri. She had spent the past year documenting the cascade of failures spreading across the galaxy. and her conclusions were more terrifying than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The galaxy's interconnected systems are collapsing faster than we can repair them, she said simply. But more critically, we lack the cognitive tools to understand why. She activated her own holographic display, showing a three-dimensional web of connections between different galactic systems. This is how humans saw our civilization, as a single, integrated organism. They understood that trade routes affected diplomatic relationships, that power grid failures could trigger social unrest, that communication breakdowns led to military conflicts. The display shifted, showing the same web with human influence removed. The connections didn't just weaken, they disappeared entirely, leaving isolated clusters of functionality that couldn't communicate with each other. The rest of us think in categories, Venkira continued. The Althari understand military matters. The Vreks grasp economic principles. The Cathari catalog information. But humans thought systemically. They saw the connections between military, economic, social, and technological systems that the rest of us couldn't perceive. An uncomfortable silence fell over the chamber. Several delegates shifted uneasily, beginning to grasp the implications of what she was saying. Are you suggesting, asked Ambassador Velchris of the Spiral Alliance, that we are mentally incapable of managing galactic civilization? I'm saying, Venkira replied carefully, that each species evolved to excel in specific areas. The humans evolved on a world that required them to be generalists, to think in terms of complex systems and multiple variables. They became the species that could see the forest instead of just the trees. The truth was even more disturbing than she was willing to state publicly. Her analysis of human databases had revealed something shocking. The humans had been deliberately designing systems that required their oversight, not out of malice, but because their integrative thinking was so fundamentally different that their systems naturally evolved to need human maintenance. Every major galactic installation had hidden dependencies, subtle requirements for the kind of flexible, adaptive thinking that only humans possessed. The Jumpgate network needed constant micro-adjustments that required intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics. The atmospheric processors had to balance dozens of variables that couldn't be reduced to simple algorithms. Even the diplomatic protocols were built around the human ability to understand and bridge different cultural perspectives. There's something else, Venkira continued reluctantly. I've been monitoring communications from the Sol system. Earth has been transformed during their isolation. The display changed again, showing long-range sensor readings from humanity's home system. Massive structures surrounded the star, technology that made the rest of galactic civilization look primitive by comparison. Clearly, humanity hadn't spent their isolation sulking. They had been advancing at an incredible pace, freed from the need to maintain aging galactic infrastructure. Several species have sent envoys to Earth, she reported. All have been turned away. The entire Sol system is surrounded by some kind of barrier that our sensors can't penetrate. The few messages that have gotten through receive only automated responses. The message was always the same. The Terran Federation is not currently accepting galactic communications. General Kexthara stood abruptly, his massive form towering over the other delegates. Then we make them listen, he declared. We send a full military escort to demand their assistance. With what ships? Asked Thelkoros quietly. Half our fleet is dealing with the Devourer. The other half is trying to maintain order in systems on the verge of collapse. And frankly, General, based on what we're seeing from Earth, I'm not sure our weapons would be effective against their defenses. The brutal reality was settling over them all. They had spent decades dismissing human contributions as inefficient, chaos. Now they were faced with the possibility that chaos, creativity, flexibility, adaptability, was exactly what complex systems needed to survive. The Galactic University had provided perhaps the starkest example of this truth. Research. Output had plummeted by 78% since humanity's departure. Without human cross-disciplinary thinking, alien scientists found themselves trapped in their species-specific approaches to knowledge. The Cathari could catalog vast amounts of information but struggled with innovation. The Althari understood engineering and weapons, but not biological systems. The Vrex grasped economic modeling, but not social dynamics. The Spirians excelled at energy manipulation, but not materials science. Alone, each species was brilliant within their specialty. Together, they should have been unstoppable. But they couldn't work together effectively without humans to bridge the gaps between their different ways of thinking. "So what do we do?" asked Ambassador Vel Chris, her crystalline skin dim with despair. Ven Kira looked around the converted cargo. Hold that now served as the galaxy's seat of government, at the desperate faces of beings who had once ruled a civilization spanning millions of worlds. "We survive," she said simply. "We adapt. We learn. And we hope that when the humans are finally ready to talk, we're still here to listen." Outside the ship's viewports, the stars that had once been connected by humanity's vision flickered alone. In the darkness, isolated points of light in a galaxy that was forgetting how to shine. 2.5 years after humanity's withdrawal, entire star systems had vanished from galactic maps. Not destroyed, simply gone dark, their beacon signals dead, their communications silent, their populations unknown. The hyperspace network that had once connected hundreds of worlds now functioned only in isolated clusters, leaving vast regions of space as unreachable as distant galaxies. Ven Kira stood on the observation deck of what remained of the Galactic Research Station, watching. A convoy of refugee ships arrived from the Centauri sector. Each vessel carried the survivors of another failed world, another collapsed system, another piece of civilization that had crumbled without the connective tissue humanity had provided. "Scholar," called her assistant Melvok, his young voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "The Althari fleet is requesting emergency assistance. The Devourer has reached the Vegan colonies." Ven Kira closed her large eyes in grief. The Vegan system housed over 2 billion beings across 4 inhabited worlds. If the Devourer consumed them as it had consumed 17 other systems, the death toll would be beyond comprehension. The entity had grown more dangerous with each victory. What had begun as a simple parasitic organism had evolved into something that defied all scientific understanding. It consumed not just biological matter, but technology, energy, even information itself. Worse, it learned from every encounter, adapting faster than any natural organism should be able to. General Kex Thara commanded the defense of Vega Prime from the bridge of his flagship, watching in horror as his most powerful weapons proved not just useless, but counterproductive. Every time his fleet fired on the creature, it absorbed the energy and grew stronger. Every tactical formation his forces employed was countered within minutes as the Devourer learned and adapted. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, "the creature has replicated our shield harmonics. It's using them against us." Kex Thara's 4 hands clenched into fists. His military training had prepared him for every conceivable enemy. Hostile fleets, planetary invasions, space pirates, terrorist organizations. But no military academy had taught courses on fighting an opponent that became stronger with every engagement, that learned from every mistake, that turned your own strengths against you. The humans would have understood immediately. They would have realized that fighting chaos with order was futile, that defeating an adaptive enemy required being more adaptive yourself. But the Althari military mind, trained for centuries in the virtues of discipline and predictable tactics, couldn't make that leap. "All ships maintain formation," Kex Thara ordered, even as he watched another of his cruisers dissolve under the Devourer's assault. "Continue bombardment pattern 7. It was all he knew how to do. Meanwhile, in what had once been the galaxy's economic center, the final Vrex trade stations were shutting down. Zilch stood in his empty office, looking out at cargo bays that would never again bustle with activity from dozens of species. The mathematical perfection his people had dreamed of had created a nightmare of inefficiency and conflict. The humans were right, he said to his empty office, his mandibles clicking softly with defeat. Commerce isn't about numbers. It's about trust. The Vrex had spent decades analyzing human trade routes, finding them illogical and wasteful. Human ships took longer routes to avoid cultural taboos, carried extra cargo to maintain relationships, made stops that served no apparent economic purpose. The mathematical models had shown clearly that Vrex efficiency could improve profits by 30%. Instead, Vrex efficiency had destroyed the galaxy's economy entirely. Their rigid algorithms couldn't account for the fact that the Spirian Collective would rather starve than deal with traders who violated their sacred spaces. They couldn't calculate the value of the trust relationships that human merchants had built over generations. They had no equation for measuring the cost of cultural misunderstandings. In the abandoned halls of the Galactic University, knowledge itself was dying. The vast archives that had once contained the collected wisdom of 47 species were becoming useless without human translators to bridge the gaps between different ways of thinking. Dr. Yel Thane, one of the few remaining research coordinators, walked through laboratories that had once buzzed with groundbreaking discoveries. Now they sat empty, their equipment gathering dust, their experiments abandoned. The various species that had contributed to galactic science couldn't work together effectively without human integration. The protein folding research is stalled, she muttered to herself, reviewing the latest reports. The Cathari have the data, but they can't understand the Althari theoretical framework. The Spirians have the energy manipulation techniques, but they can't communicate them to the Vrex mathematicians. Each species remained brilliant within their specialty, but science was becoming a Tower of Babel, with each group speaking a language the others couldn't comprehend. The humans had been the universal translators, not just of words, but of concepts, approaches, and ways of understanding the universe. On her research station, Venkira had documented the most disturbing discovery of all. Deep in the human databases, hidden in technical specifications and maintenance logs, she had found the truth about galactic infrastructure. They knew, she whispered to Melvok as they reviewed the data. The humans knew their systems would fail without them. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. Every major installation had been designed with hidden dependencies on human cognitive abilities. The jump gate network required intuitive adjustments that couldn't be programmed into algorithms. The atmospheric processors needed creative problem-solving that rigid procedures couldn't provide. Even the diplomatic protocols assumed the presence of beings who could understand and bridge multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously. But Scholar, Melvok protested, why would they do this? Were they trying to make us dependent on them? Venkira shook her head sadly. No, young one, they didn't do it deliberately. They simply built systems the way their minds worked, flexible, adaptive, integrated. To them, this was the only logical way to design complex technology. They couldn't imagine minds that couldn't see the connections they saw so clearly. It was the ultimate irony. Humanity had been dismissed as chaotic and inefficient, but their chaos was actually a higher form of order, the kind of dynamic stability that allowed complex systems to adapt and survive. Without that chaos, the galaxy's rigid order was collapsing into entropy. The proof was visible from any starport. Ships that had once crossed the galaxy in days now took weeks to travel between neighboring systems. Communication networks that had once carried real-time conversations across hundreds of light years now struggled to transmit simple messages within single sectors. Manufacturing centers that had once produced goods for billion-being markets now barely served local populations, but perhaps the most heartbreaking sight was in the abandoned sectors where entire civilizations had simply given up. The Outer Rim, worlds cut off from galactic civilization by the collapsed beacon network, had begun reverting to pre-spaceflight technology. Some planets were already experiencing famines as their populations, swollen by centuries of galactic trade, exceeded what their local resources could support. Desperate times had led to desperate measures. 3 separate species had attempted to send envoys to the Sol system, hoping to negotiate humanity's return. All had found Earth's star system surrounded by megastructures that dwarfed anything in the known galaxy, protected by energy barriers that their sensors couldn't penetrate. The few messages that had reached Earth received only automated responses. The Terran Federation is not currently accepting galactic communications. Please direct all inquiries to the appropriate galactic authorities. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The galactic authorities no longer existed in any meaningful sense. General Kex Thera's latest report from the Vega system painted the bleakest picture yet. The Devourer had consumed 2 of the system's 4 inhabited worlds, and his remaining forces were in full retreat. But the creature wasn't just destroying, it was learning, evolving, becoming something that might eventually threaten every world in the galaxy. "We need new tactics," he had transmitted in his final report before communications were lost. "But I don't know how to think new thoughts." That admission from the galaxy's proudest military commander summarized the crisis perfectly. They all knew they needed to change, to adapt, to find new ways of thinking. But change required the kind of flexibility that their species had evolved away from in favor of specialization. Only humanity had retained the cognitive chaos necessary for true adaptation, and humanity was gone. As Venkira watched another refugee convoy dock with her station, she realized that time was running out. The collapse was accelerating, and soon there might be nothing left to save. The galaxy needed its humans back, but pride, politics, and simple stubbornness kept the remaining authorities from admitting their desperate need. She made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Gathering her research data, her documentation of the crisis, and her evidence of humanity's critical role in galactic civilization, she began preparing for a journey to the Sol system. If the galaxy wouldn't officially ask for humanity's help, then 3 years after humanity's departure, the desperate coalition that represented what remained of galactic civilization approached the Sol system in a small fleet of mismatched vessels. Leading them was Venkira's research ship, followed by General Kex Thera's battered flagship, a Vrex cargo vessel carrying Zilch's economic data, and diplomatic ships from a dozen other surviving governments. They had come not as conquerors or negotiators, but as supplicants. The galaxy was dying, and they finally understood that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. As their ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of humanity's solar system, the alien delegates gasped in collective amazement. The space around Earth's star had been transformed into something beyond their wildest imagination. Massive ring structures encircled the sun, harvesting its energy on a scale that dwarfed the rest of galactic civilization. Artificial habitats the size of moons dotted the system, their surfaces gleaming with technologies that seemed to blend matter and energy in impossible ways. "By the ancestors," whispered Ambassador Velcris, her crystalline skin flickering with reflected light from the megastructures. "What have they built?" The answer came as their ships encountered the barrier surrounding the system. Not a crude energy field, but something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, analyzing their vessels with scanning, methods that made their own technology look primitive. After several tense minutes, a transmission reached them in perfect galactic standard. "Attention approaching vessels. State your purpose and intent. You are entering Terran Federation space by invitation only." Venkira stepped forward to the communication console, her aged hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "This is Scholar Venkira of the Kethari, archives representing the Emergency Coalition of Galactic Governments. We request an audience with Federation leadership regarding the current crisis in galactic civilization." There was a long pause. Then, surprisingly, a familiar voice responded, "Venkira, this is Elena Vasquez. I remember you from the Xenolinguistics conferences. You may approach, but your escorts will remain at the barrier." As Venkira's ship was guided through the barrier, she saw that the other delegates had tears in there, various optical organs. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to them without hatred, fear, or desperate need. Elena's voice had carried the same calm professionalism that had made human diplomats so effective. The ship docked with a space station that seemed to grow from living crystal and flowing metal, its architecture impossible by any known engineering principles. Elena Vasquez met them at the airlock, and Venkira was surprised to see that she appeared unchanged by the 3 years that had aged the rest of the galaxy so terribly. "Elena," Venkira said, using the informal address that had marked their old friendship. "Thank you for seeing us. I know what we did was exactly what we expected," Elena interrupted gently. "Please, all of you, come. We have much to discuss." The conference room they were led to was a marvel of engineering that somehow felt perfectly natural, with walls that seemed to breathe and furniture that adjusted automatically to each species' comfort needs. But what struck the delegates most was the holographic display dominating the center of the room, a real-time map of the entire galaxy, showing in perfect detail the extent of the collapse they were living through. "You've been watching?" General Kexthara said, his voice heavy with realization. Elena nodded. "We never stopped monitoring galactic communications. We've tracked every system failure, every crisis, every refugee movement." Her expression grew sad. "We've watched our friends and colleagues struggle with problems we could have solved in hours." "Then why didn't you help?" Zilch demanded, his mandibles clicking with frustration. "Billions have died while you sat here building whatever this is." Elena's response was measured but firm. "Because you needed to learn. Because helping you, the way we always had, would have solved nothing. You would have gone back to treating us as your maintenance crew, your problem solvers, your convenient scapegoats when things went wrong." She gestured to the holographic display, which zoomed in on various crisis points across the galaxy. "Look at what's happening. The Devourer isn't just consuming worlds. It's adapting faster than your rigid military tactics can counter. Your trade networks aren't just inefficient. They're actively creating conflicts because they ignore cultural factors. Your research has stagnated because each species is trapped in its own way of thinking." General Kexthara shifted uncomfortably. "Our military doctrine is perfect for fighting other military forces that follow the same doctrine," Elena finished, "but useless against an enemy that doesn't follow any rules at all. The Devourer wins because it's creative, adaptive, chaotic. It thinks outside every box you try to put it in." The truth was harder to hear than any of them had expected. They had come hoping for salvation, for humanity to swoop in and fix everything as they always had. Instead, they were being forced to confront their own limitations. "What do you want from us?" Venkira asked quietly. Elena's expression softened. "What we've always wanted. Partnership. Real partnership, not the old arrangement where humanity did the thinking and everyone else followed orders or complained about our methods." The holographic display shifted, showing new images. Mixed crews working on advanced projects, beings from different species collaborating in ways that had never been possible before. Technologies that combined the best insights from multiple ways of thinking. "We've spent 3 years not just building," Elena explained, "but learning. Learning to think like Althari when precision is needed, like Vrex when calculation is required, like Kethari when knowledge must be preserved. We've discovered that our greatest strength isn't that we're better than other species, it's that we can integrate other ways of thinking into our own." She paused, letting that sink in. But integration requires trust. It requires accepting that different approaches have value. It requires admitting that no single species has all the answers. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in galactic diplomatic history. Elena wasn't interested in simple agreements or treaties. She wanted fundamental changes in how species related to each other, how decisions were made, how problems were approached. The devourer can be stopped, she said during one session, but not by any single species approach. It requires Althari, military precision combined with Rex mathematical modeling, Cathari data analysis, Spirian energy manipulation, and human adaptive thinking. Each piece is essential, but none is sufficient alone. The same principle applied to every other crisis facing the galaxy. The collapsed trade networks could be rebuilt, but only if cultural factors were weighted equally with mathematical efficiency. The failing infrastructure could be repaired, but only if rigid maintenance schedules incorporated human flexibility. The stagnated research could resume, but only if different species learned to truly collaborate rather than simply coexist. It took weeks of difficult discussions, with delegates returning to their ships each night to argue with their home governments, via quantum communication. Some species balked at the idea of fundamental change. Others worried about losing their distinct identities in a more integrated civilization. But as reports continued to arrive of new systems going dark, of the devourer consuming more worlds, of refugees dying in ships that couldn't reach safe harbor, the reality became undeniable. Change or die, adapt or perish, learn to think together or face extinction separately. The breakthrough came when Ven Kira made a simple but profound observation. We've been thinking of this as humanity returning to help us. But that's not what you're offering, is it? You're offering to teach us to think the way you think, so we can help ourselves. Elena smiled. The first genuine smile any of them had seen from a human in 3 years. Now you're beginning to understand. The Terran Accords, signed in a ceremony that was broadcast to every surviving world in the galaxy, weren't a simple peace treaty or trade agreement. They were a blueprint for a new kind of civilization, one where diversity of thought was seen as strength, where different species contributed their unique perspectives to shared challenges, where the chaos of creativity was balanced with the order of specialized knowledge. The first joint human galactic mission launched within days of the signing. A mixed crew of beings who had never worked together before, prepared to face the devourer using tactics that no single species could have developed alone. As their ship departed for the war zone, General Kexthara found himself learning to think, in ways that went against every instinct his military training had developed. Beside him, human tactical officers were learning to apply Althari precision to their creative strategies. The fusion was uncomfortable, difficult, and sometimes frustrating. It was also devastatingly effective. The devourer, faced with tactics that combined rigid planning with creative chaos, found its adaptive abilities overwhelmed. For the first time since its emergence, the creature retreated instead of advancing, confused by an enemy that could be simultaneously predictable and surprising. But perhaps the most important change happened in the research.